This leads us to the challenge that altogether there are 7 types or classes of third declension nouns, of which for this chapter we've really learned 2, and if you include the vocabulary word Simon or Simone in Greek, then we learned 3. If you add other past vocabulary that you already learned, like Jesus' name, then we've actually learned 4 types. So far, we've learned the velars using the paradigmatic word sarx. We learned the dentals using soma or pneuma or anima. They're all the same type of dentals. And then we've been introduced to one type of nasal or liquid stem, Simone, which ends with the new. And then you've already learned the paradigm for Jesus. And these are what we call irregular or partially indeclinable nouns. So some forms of the third declension nouns, because especially if they're translations of foreign words like Jesus, Jesus, being the transliteration for Yeshua, especially with nouns that are borrowed from other languages. Sometimes they're indeclinable or only decline in part. And you already learned the paradigm, so I won't rehearse it here, but Jesus is also a third declension noun. So you've learned or been introduced to 4 of the 7 types already, if we include chapter 10. We will later learn the other types. You'll learn about bilabials and how that looks like in third declension nouns. If the stem ends with a sigma, how that's written out as a paradigm. And then we'll learn something called semivowel. So let's learn the 313 adjectives. And it's called the 313 because the masculine endings use a third declension ending. The neuter ending uses a third declension ending. But the feminine endings use the first declension endings. And a good paradigmatic adjective that's 313 is pas, pasa, pon. And so we have pas, pasa, pon. This is the lexical form. If you were to see this written out in your lexicon, it'd be written as pas, pasa, pon. This is the masculine form, the feminine form, and the neuter form. Now the problem, of course, is that with third declension nouns, you don't see the stem in the nominative singular. Remember that it's in the genitive singular. That's where you see the stem. So you need to remember that the stem for the third declension masculine and neuter forms is pont. That's the stem. And the feminine form of this adjective uses pas. So here's the first declension feminine form. The third declension masculine neuter forms will use pont as the stem. And so when we learn pas, pasa, pon, which, by the way, means every in the singular. So all the singular forms should be translated as every. And then all the plural forms should be translated as all. So this is for every in the singular, all for the plural forms. And you can imagine how many times the word every or all occurs in our New Testament. And so this is a form that you simply must know really well. But if you know pas, pasa, pon, this 313 adjective really well, then all other 313 adjectives will look like pas, pasa, pon, and you'll do just fine. So if the stem for the third declension endings, third declension masculine and neuter forms of the adjective is pont, let me write this out, pont. Remember what the case endings are for the third declension masculine forms. Remember that it's sigma, os, e, a, s, on, si or sin, os. So those are the endings. So what happens when I add to pont, if I add pont to the sigma here? Well, the nutal drops, and then we get pas as the nominative singular form. And so remember, the nominative singular form in third declension nouns are the ones that are kind of they change the most. The nominative singular forms change the most. And therefore, a lot of times the stem is hidden and you can't see the nominative singular form. You really must rely on the genitive singular form to tell you what the stem is. So if the stem is pont and I add os to it, then the genitive form is pontos. So you have pos for the nominative singular, pontos for the genitive singular. For the dative singular, it's ponti. And for the accusative singular, it's ponta. For the nominative plural, it's pontes. For the genitive plural, it's pontone. Let me mark that as a new better. Pontone. For the dative plural, it's pont plus sin. Remember what happens when you combine these two together? It becomes a sigma. The new drops. The new tau drops. So the form is posse or sin. This is the dative singular. It's very similar to what happens here with pos. You have the stem pont. You add sigma to it. The new tau drops, and it becomes pos. And then add pont for the accusative plural plus os. And then add pont to the accusative plural, and then add os, and you get pontos. And so let's say the masculine forms for the adjective pos, possa, pon. It's pos, pontos, ponti, ponta, pontes, pontone, possen, pontos. So let's say this again. Pos, pontos, ponti, ponta, pontes, pontone, possen, and pontos. And those are the masculine forms. Now I'm going to clear the board. The neuter forms. Well, the neuter forms, they are also third declension. And again, we're going to use pont. And let's go over the endings. The endings will be, it's nothing, os, e, nothing. These are the case endings for the neuter third declension forms. Alpha, own, it's not that clear. Own, C or sin, alpha. So nothing, os, e, nothing, alpha, own, C or sin, alpha. So if we have the stem pont and you add os to it, it's pontos. But notice what happens with this. If I have pont as the stem and I add to it nothing. There's nothing added to it. The new tau doesn't like that. So in this case, adding nothing to it, the tau drops and the pon remains. And so it becomes pon. So it's pon, pontos. The dative plural, the dative singular is ponti. And then we have pon again because you add nothing to it and the tau drops and you have pon. So pon, pontos, ponti, and pon. And then we have pont plus alpha, ponta, pontone. And this is something we've seen already. Add to pont, C or sin, the new tau drops, and it becomes posse or sin. And then the accusative plural is like the nominative plural, it is ponta. So let's say these forms right here. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Pon, pontos, ponti, pon, ponta, pontone, possen, ponta. And then lastly, let's go over the feminine forms. Let me clear the board. So let's go over the feminine form for the adjective pos, possa, pon. Now for the feminine form, it uses a different stem. It's pos. And it uses the first declension endings. Now notice that this is a sibilant stem. And we already went over this. With the noun doxa, we know that the sibilant doxa, which means glory, We know that the sibilant stem switches between the alpha and eta in the genitive and dative singular forms. And then the rest of it looks like what we would expect it to. So if the stem is pos, and that's a sibilant stem, the case endings for the first declension nouns are a, ace, a iota subscript, on, I, own, ice, os. And so here, the first declension forms, we don't have to worry about changes to the stem. It's because and so the first declension form is fairly straightforward. So add alpha to the stem pos, and you get possa. That's the nominative singular form. The genitive singular form is posses. The dative form is posse, iota subscript. The accusative form singular is possan. What about the plural forms? The nominative plural is possai, the genitive plural, posson, the dative plural, possais, and the accusative plural, possas. And those are the forms. Let's clear the board. And here I just want to highlight a particular note. This is unique to the adjective pos, pos, upon, and that it likes taking what we call the predicate position when it modifies a noun. So if I wanted to say every man, notice this is here's your adjective. This is an A, here's your definite article, D, this is your noun, N. This is an ADN syntax, an ADN sequence. But yet, what we'll translate this as, not everyone is a man, but we translate this like we would in the attributive adjective, we translate it as every man. So even though where pos is positioned is in the predicate position, not the attributive position. So it's not in the attributive position. Nevertheless, we translate pos in the predicate position as adjectively, as every man. So Mounts explains this in his textbook, so go ahead and read over that note. And when you see this put in use in practice in your homework, it'll become clear how pos, pos, upon works.